Seems we are live. So let's get to it. Just welcome to everyone who is watching this webinar. Many of us are coming from Pretoria, but we know that we have many listeners all over South Africa, but also from Kenya, France, Ghana, the DRC, Mauritius, China, other parts of the world. My name is Joel Mudiri from the Department of Jurisprudence, and I'm very happy to moderate this discussion on the idea of a post-COVID African future, really to help us explore the question of what the future holds for our continent, Africa, but always already our world in which the continent is in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm sure for all of us, it's an understatement to say that the COVID-19 pandemic, or the coronavirus as we know it, which was discovered around late 2019, but has a long history, has taken the world by storm. Our daily activities, our public, private, professional lives have been brought to a halt as we've been forced to isolate at home, quarantine in different locations, and in some ways, our working world or our daily lives have been brought into a crisis, or maybe a kind of revelation, as our work, our social lives have had to change. There are many ways to think about this. There are, I would say, two major effects of this pandemic. The first has been the massive medical, scientific, technological, and environmental challenges that it has posed. The new and old questions around science, around medicine, around the environment that we are now having to confront in a very serious way have come to the fore, and all the labor that is involved in that effort. But the second one has been the financial, the social, the mental, the interpersonal, and the psychological effects, the human costs of this virus. This virus, as we know, has had a global impact. It's not simply a Pretoria problem or a South African problem or a African problem. It's a global problem. We are all vulnerable to it, whether you are royalty, whether you're a celebrity, whether you are the worker, or whether you're poor. The virus knows no borders, it knows no boundaries. But it's important to remember that the virus tracks and intensifies very old and enduring fault lines: race, class, gender, those inequalities that we see, problems of domestic violence, unemployment, poverty, the crisis of sanitation. So it highlights many of the inequalities that we face in our society, but it also surfaces the interdependence that all human communities now require as we come together in solidarity and cooperation to try and find a way out, or a way into a new future after COVID, or during and after COVID. I want to say two more things before I open the conversation. The first is we should remember the many people who wake up in the morning to keep the world going, as many of us are isolated, or as the intensity of work is reduced. We should remember all the farm workers, the sanitation workers, the petrol attendants, our truck drivers, our taxi drivers, plumbers, electricians, the people who work in social services, in our grocery stores, the maintenance workers, the cleaners, the teachers, but of course, most importantly, as we know, our doctors, our pharmacists, our nurses and workers in hospitals, who are at the front lines of what people are calling this invisible war, or this war against an invisible enemy. The second important thing we should always remember, of course, that we need to hold as we think about this question of a post-COVID future, or post-COVID African future, is the massive death toll, the loss of human lives that has rocked the entire world, and the limits to how we can grieve this loss. Anyone who saw the front page of the New York Times recently would see that the list is almost endless of the many lives that have been affected and taken by the coronavirus pandemic. So the world has been irrevocably transformed by this experience of 2020. But as we also know, a crisis is an opportunity, is an opening into a future, but it's an opportunity for reimagination, for rethinking. And this is really what we are going to be discussing today. The University of Pretoria, as in the first place, the largest residential multi-campus university in South Africa, but also as the leading research or training and research intensive university in Africa, has already responded extensively to the crisis posed by the pandemic, but it's also continuing to put its resources, but also its personnel to the task of responding to the crisis, and in a way leading the way into a future Africa, or an African future after COVID. And this is what we'll be discussing in today's webinar. I have here three colleagues. I don't know if I can call my boss also my colleague, but I have here three colleagues reflecting on this topic and giving us really an update on the University of Pretoria's leading role in responding to the crisis, but also in thinking about a future at the same time. So we have Professor Kupe, Professor Mbao, and Professor Markota. I'm just going to briefly read their biographies to everyone, just to give you a sense of the kind of people and expertise that we're going to be having today. Professor Tawana Kupe, of course, needs no introduction. He's the Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the University of Pretoria since 2019. Prior to his appointment, as we know, he held several senior positions, including as Senior Vice Principal at the University of the Witwatersrand, where he also founded the Media Studies Department and headed the Humanities faculty. He also lectured at Rhodes University. Before Rhodes, Professor Kupe worked in various academic capacities at the University of Zimbabwe. He holds a BA degree and a master's degree in English from the University of Zimbabwe, as well as a DPhil in Media Studies from the University of Oslo in Norway, where he was traveling recently, if I recall. But in December 2019, Professor Kupe was also awarded an honorary doctorate in humanities at Michigan State University. Then we also have Professor Sheikh Mbao, who is our director of the leading Future Africa Institute at the University of Pretoria. Professor Mbao, before joining us, served as the executive director of the START International in Washington, D.C., and also as lead scientist on climate change at the World Agroforestry Center in Kenya. He is adjunct associate professor at Michigan State University's Department of Forestry and has worked for a number of organizations, IPCC, Future Earth, and the Global Observation of Forest Cover. Professor Mbao worked on drivers of land resources dynamics, and he's worked on climate change, which are very pressing issues at the moment. His vision for the Future Africa Institute, which he now leads, is for the Institute to serve as a seedbed for sustainable transformation on the continent, and will be a new model for tertiary education's approach to address the challenges of the 21st century. And these challenges, as we see, are unprecedented and unpredictable. Finally, Professor Wanda Markota, who's also on campus here with me and Professor Kupe, is the director of the Center for Viral Zoonosis, and she is the NRF DSI South African Research Chair in Infectious Diseases of Animals. She's a virologist who is leading a multidisciplinary research program that's focusing on bats as viral hosts in Africa. In addition to virology, her work also investigates factors leading to disease spillover, such as ecology, the environment, human behavior. So these questions, on the one hand, climate change, future Africa, the 21st century. On the other hand, questions of ecology, the environment, and indeed infectious diseases, which is what we're dealing with, are at the forefront of the discussion we're going to be having today. So I'm going to hand over to Professor Kupe just to give us a context into the discussion before our speakers start. Professor Kupe, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Professor Joel Mudire. The issue is here that, as you know, May is Africa Month and 25 May is Africa Day. It's the best time to take a critical, reflective position on the past, the present, and also the future we want as the African continent. We all know what African continent we want. Peaceful, where there's security, where there's participatory democracy, social well-being, observance of human rights, including women and children's rights, and also sustainable, and also a continent that takes its prideful place among other continents of the world and makes a contribution. So this is very, very important. Also, universities are important on the African continent. And you can see it in the current context of the pandemic, which teaches us one thing. The pandemic is a very specific issue, right? But it's not, the issues it raises are not new on the continent. And these issues have the following characteristics. They are complex, they are complicated, and they are intersectional. So the pandemic is not just a medical crisis or a disease crisis, but it's also a crisis, as you rightly said, Professor Modiri. a crisis of society, a crisis of the economy, a crisis of governance. We've seen what has been happening around the continent, and it is also global. African problems have a global resonance, but of course they manifest themselves in a particular way on the African continent. So the question is, what role can universities play in ensuring that these complex, complicated intersectional issues are addressed in the best interest of creating the continent that we actually want? I think that universities as knowledge institutions, and in this pandemic, we have seen something, and I'll refer to the things that you did. You have seen, we have seen people actually involved at all levels of the problem, from research into viruses, as Professor Wanda Makota, the expert, will tell us about that, into how some of these viruses might infect human beings from the rest of the environment, into clinical trials. Also, universities have stepped in to make sanitizers, to make personal protective equipment, all aspects of all dimensions of the complex problems. And I think that there is such a huge space, and the University of Pretoria has taken up this challenge by creating centers like Professor Wanda Makota's Center for Zoonotic Viruses, then the latest Future Africa Institute that Sheikh is actually leading. And if you listen carefully to both the professors' CVs, there's one thing that characterizes them. They work, their knowledge and their research cuts across disciplinary boundaries, because social issues or societal problems do not know disciplinary boundaries. They actually require a multiplicity of forms of knowledge to be able to address them, to create a new future. That is the aspiration of the University of Pretoria, with that kind of university that enters the space of co-creation of knowledge, which co-creation of knowledge addresses the complexity, the complicated nature, and also the intersectional nature of problems. I think it is only through creating a critical mass of such centers, institutes, collaborating within South Africa, across the continent, collaborating and partnering across the world, that indeed will actually, in essence, are able to defeat, if that is the right word, viruses like the coronavirus and also other viruses that might emerge, because this is not going to be a once-off issue. But the issue is we must actually be prepared, and we must actually not suffer paralysis, and we must actually deploy knowledge, and we must actually save lives, and we must actually create a more certain, stable, sustainable world where in a sense, people can have a better life. So we're very delighted at the University of Pretoria that through our partnerships and our networks, we're able, in a sense, to participate in a co-creation of knowledge that sustains humanity. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much, Professor Kupe, for those opening remarks. And indeed, thank you for foregrounding the context of our discussion, that being Africa Day, and in some ways, Africa Month, and a time to reflect on the continent. Professor Makota, if you could share your views and perspectives and your current work and challenges.
Thank you, Prof. Madiri and Prof. Kupe, for setting the stage for the rest of the discussions. And I think we're currently in the midst of a serious challenge for Africa, COVID-19, which, despite all the negatives that we can focus on, also provide us with a lot of new opportunities on how we want to shape the Africa we want for the future and things that we can build on. So I want to reflect just on some of the things that the university is involved in and how it will shape our future, and how we can also do more in the future to change the world and not be in this situation again, or at least try to not be in this situation again. So I think none of us were prepared for it, not even Africa. We didn't know this virus is going to emerge and it's going to spread all over the world and have this influence. But we should acknowledge that we should really be proud of Africa's response. We've done much better than most of our Western counterparts so far, and we hope it's going to continue. And there's really good leadership that emerged from the continent, and it's really something to be proud of and celebrate in this month of Africa Month and Africa Day. And specifically from an academic and a research environment, we can and we are contributing towards solutions that's got an immediate impact now in the outbreak, but it's also going to have an impact after the outbreak and rethinking the future of research. And University of Pretoria, as Prof. Kupe also mentioned, play a leading role in these initiatives, not on our own, in collaboration with a lot of partnerships nationally, internationally. And we are planning to do that beyond COVID also. I think one of the things that became very prominent, one thing we're also doing now is these online platforms that we're using that is opening up communication. So it's something that's been with us for a while, but it's never been a necessity. We used it when we felt like it. And now it's opening up the world to people like Africans that can't travel to places to have the opportunities to be part of any team and any discussion and knowledge sharing. So that I think will stay with us in the future. We've also realized that healthcare investment was just inadequate, and we're not unique in that. It's a worldwide problem. We've seen it even in some of the Western countries. And the university really stepped up to the plate with thinking about innovative ways of supplying basic things like PPE, which is an immediate need now using 3D printing. People have just got so innovative in really providing things that we couldn't import, or it cost us too much to import, or there was just no supply. And we must remember this is an infrastructure and skills that we've developed that will go beyond COVID in the future, because we still need PPE for TB and for other infectious diseases in our hospitals after COVID. And we've seen a lot of challenges with testing, and there's been applications for grants that we're also involved in, where we're looking at alternative ways of developing tests that can also be used in low resource settings. And I think what's very important in all these initiatives, it's not just about the academic work and developing a test in our labs, but it's about manufacturing this to a level that we can actually supply for the country and the continent. That is becoming a major focus of research. How are we going to apply it? How are we going to supply enough so that it can actually have a real impact and it's not just something that we developed? Vaccines, on the other hand, we're part of international platforms, also at University of Pretoria, but we're also looking from an African perspective. Yes, we want to be part of global platforms, but we also need to develop vaccines that's relevant to Africa and again supply. Can we supply when it's necessary to the continent and to Africa? I think one thing that for me also became very prominent is the role of society, and this is going to be very prominent in future research. We can have lots of ideas. We can even have exact ideas of how we prevent the disease, do lockdown, wash hands. But if we don't understand the society and how they're going to react to these rules or these guidelines and how it's going to influence their lives, their human rights, we can't do it. So we really need to understand our societies and build up these relationships from the beginning that's going to help us to prevent diseases. There's all kinds of other things that maybe Sheikh will also mention, but we're looking at fancier research where we're looking at the disease epidemiology, even looking at genome profiles of people and how we can maybe profile risk in the future and see if we're looking at your genome, is it you're a higher risk of getting serious COVID disease or not? And those things are also important because we're sitting with a unique environment in Africa, unique genome profiles. That's not the same as the European or the American environment. So we need to understand our situation. One of the other things that also became very prominent is how we can quickly incorporate COVID into what we already have. And I think health sciences is a very good example of that at University of Pretoria, where primary healthcare very quickly incorporated COVID-19, which is an infectious disease, into their primary healthcare programs that's already existing and really making a difference. And this is the future. This is how we will in the future also be focused more on multi-sectoral programs. So even now, as we are trying to develop immediate data and solution, our focus should be broader. We can get very sidetracked in just focusing on COVID-19. At some point, COVID-19 will not be there anymore, but there will be something else. And there's a very good chance that there will be something else. There will again be pressure on the healthcare challenge. There will be the same challenges, HIV, TB, all of that will also again be there. And there's a complete shift in research from reaction towards prevention and really being ready. We don't want to be caught off guard again. We don't want to make all these investments that we can't use for the future. And it has to be sustainable. So going back to the development goals again, we need to look at sustainability with everything that we do in research. And that is becoming a very important focus. So if we talk about zoonotic diseases, and COVID is considered a zoonotic disease that spilled over from an animal that we still don't know what it is, but we consider it zoonotic. There's many aspects to a zoonotic disease that we seem to forget, and it's really cross-cutting across all disciplines. It's not just about what we would call One Health. We will say we look at the animals, the humans, and the environment and how their health is all integrated. And we sometimes think it's just about the absence or the presence of the disease. So the research has been very much focused about what pathogens can we find in animals and what can we find in humans, but we seem to forget about everything in between. What's the reasons that it's spill over? These diseases will circulate, for instance, in wildlife forever. They're there, they will be new, some of them we may know, but it's what we do that bring us into contact with these animals, and then we see spillover. And there's examples of that. Is it bushmeat? Is it the wet markets? Is it deforestation? Is it climate changes? And we make lists of these things in publications that we publish as global reasons that may be very different in different settings. It may be different in continents, it may be different in countries, it may even be as specific as community specific. And we don't really understand the reasons why people are doing these things. So we would say, yes, bushmeat may be important, but why are people using bushmeat? We need to understand those factors. Is it because they're hungry? Is it a cultural reason? What is the reasons? And if we understand those reasons, we can go further and prevent, because then we can look at alternatives. And alternatives has got so many answers. You can look at very innovative agriculture, innovative ways of development. We call it smart cities, how we're not going to influence our whole ecosystem when we need to develop or try and prevent at least as much as we can in terms of damaging ecosystems. Those things become very important, because it's very easy to tell somebody don't go and eat bushmeat or don't go to the wet markets, but you're not understanding the reasons why it's happening. It will never stop if we don't really understand those reasons and we don't address it in the long term. And this is long-term solutions. It's not something that's going to change overnight. And we need research to come up with innovative ways of solving this, specifically also on the African continent. And this will lead to prevention in the end. So we have a chance to shape future research in terms of transdisciplinary. It's always been with us, this terminology, in several formats. One Health has been with us for a while, but it's now really prominent and urgent. And I think it's also the responsible way to do research in the future. We can't not do it anymore. We need to look at it from a multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary environment. And to use UP's slogan, that will lead to research that matters, but specifically also on the African continent.
We might have lost Professor Makota there. She'll come back as soon as we have a connection.
There you go.
Okay. Hi, welcome back, Professor Makota. Do you want to say a few more closing remarks?
I can. Am I back?
You're back.
Okay,
You're back.
I'm back. Yeah, I think it's just really important, although we have global partners and we will continue to work with global and international partners, it's really important that people understand the problems and can build long-term relationships also with societies that must start being the center of our research, lead projects. And we've got enough leadership to do that. It's prominent from things that University of Pretoria is doing, but also from other institutes and throughout the whole continent. And we should really play a leadership role in how we want to shape research to really answer society problems and make a difference in the future on different levels. And it also, in the end, leads to what we would call industrialization, where we can make our own products on the continent. It have an economic impact, and it has to have an impact on the daily lives of people that are affected by some of these factors in our environment.
No, thank you very much, Professor Marquardt. A lot of insight there around the fact that Africa is in fact playing a leading role globally, and that there's no turning back, that Africa has to continue to assume a central place in global affairs. But particularly interesting, and especially for those listening, is your insistence that research is going to need to be more responsible, and it needs to be geared towards sustainability. So these are some of the things we're going to be talking about during question and answer time. One thing just to say to the audience is, as you know, we've all moved online onto virtual platforms with their obvious difficulties and challenges. So there will be some technical glitches here and there. This is our new normal. So we appeal to you for patience, but also to be part of this exciting new world where we are talking online and sometimes screens go black and so forth. So please always just bear with us. We are still here for the next hour, and the conversation will continue. Professor Mbao, your contribution.
Yes,
Professor Mbao, if you just check your sound, maybe unmute on your end. Let's give it a second or two just so that we can get Professor Mbao's sound back.
I can hear you. Do you hear me now?
Yes. Perfect.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here. I share my colleagues' viewpoints with the training statement and development given by my colleague Tawana, and these are all relevant. And I will try to bring a complementary perspective by trying to share 3 talking points. My first talking point is, what did really COVID change in Africa, and what is the likely change that we will see in Africa in relationship to COVID? My second talking point is about how we prepare ourselves for the future. Because, you know, there's a great deal of actions which are taking place already on the ground right now, but projecting ourselves in the near and long-term future is extremely essential on the way we perceive this COVID and its impact on our society. And finally, I will try to share some activities and related solutions offered by Future Africa under the leadership of our Vice-Chancellor, Prof. Kupe, and other colleagues, and how Future Africa can be part of the solution in the COVID. So about my first talking point, I would like just to share with the attendees that the COVID created a sort of knockdown, but it's not a knockout. We are still very conscious about what is happening in the moment, and yet we're trying to find the solutions to adjust and cope with the medical crisis. But there's so many dimensions of it that it needs a wider thinking approach to make sure that the solutions are sustainable. So what has really changed? Let me tell you that I have the impression that the COVID has really changed the notion of resilience. You know, when we talk more about resilience in the past, we try to differentiate the rich and the poor being more vulnerable, and yet the possibilities for them to be resilient is very low as compared to the rich, who was more resilient because they get the resources to face the crisis. But this topic just flipped this model, that resilience is not always the means you have on your hands, the assets you have on your hands to be responsive to a crisis. It can mean different other things, including the social dynamics you can put in place to make sure that the solidarity, the chain of solidarity that needs to be established to respond to crisis are in place. And this has been demonstrated, particularly in Africa, where the crisis, the health crisis has had different impacts as compared to the rest of the world. But the social dynamic in place are quite strong as compared to others. And even though our medical system is the weakest, the hit is less severe in Africa compared to other countries. That's the lesson number one I have seen. The lesson number two in this change of conceptualizing the international relationship is the global asymmetry has also changed. The previous geopolitics in the world was opposing, countries with strong economies and strong armies. And now all those things are based on ideology. But the COVID came and showed that the change in the 21st century are most likely to be environmental driven and not ideologically driven. So that's something I said already in 2009 under the program called AMPA in West Africa, that the crises of the 21st century are likely to be environmental crises. And really is one of them. And as Prophet Kupe said in this introduction, it's likely to be the case for the future, and we need to be prepared. About crises like COVID. The good news is that the Voice Africa has never been heard as it is now under COVID. You have seen so many, solutions driven by Africans, produced domestically, and offered to address the COVID. That was really a bottom-up, solution based for Africa. Even though we might not be always agreeing with Madagascar on the Artemisia, at least they get the standing to come up front and say, okay, we're offering a solution to the world. It has an unprecedented situation where Africa would invite other continents to come to the African solution for global crisis. It has been the same when we're trying to build local ventilators, which are worth $50 rather than $5,000 in Senegal, or the bravery of medical doctors in South Africa, which has shown, a momentum of dedication to solve this work. So the rhetoric in Africa is changing. There are more positive rhetoric coming out of Africa. And for the first time, those rhetoric has not been made by someone else. It has been made by African fellows themselves. So at the beginning of the COVID, what we heard is the apocalyptic message that Africa is slumbering, that the COVID would hit them very hard. Nothing comparable to other things happening in other continents. We never saw that chaos. And because there are many things, I mentioned the social dynamic, I mentioned the way we interact to each other, but also there is a big, asset we have in Africa is our preparedness to crises like COVID. It's the only continent where you have similar events happening, like the Zika, the Ebola, the Rift Valley fever, the dengue, malaria, HIV. All those big things have happened in Africa, but still, the continent is surviving. So having a COVID is just like a drop on the ocean. It's a serious issue. We should take it very seriously, but at the same time, we have been navigating different crises of that kind in the past. And therefore, we are psychologically more prepared. We are socially more prepared. And our, the community engagement to face those crises are there to protect us. So Africa is under endurance against those crises. And this is important because in this situation of run for your life kind of situation, Africa has to work for Trump and students. They have to create their own responses that adapt to the situation, and that's what we're doing. And on this first talking point, I would also mention the issues of uncertainty, how to manage uncertainty in the realm of the scattered and partial data collection that we have. We have been separating information related to agriculture, separating it from health, although nutrition and health go together. We have been separating conservation of biodiversity with health, and we saw that these connections are now established. This is an invitation. The COVID is for us a big invitation to think differently, to have a system thinking, to have a cross-disciplinary thinking, as my colleague Wanda just mentioned. So those changes which are happening in Africa have their silver lining, they have the positive effect, and we need to consider those positive effects, including the rhetoric, the positive rhetoric in Africa, the global asymmetry, the voice of Africa being heard, and the notion of resistance to being visible. So on my second talking point, how do we prepare for the future? So many people think about the future by taking the proof of evidence of the present and the past. But the future is, the object of the future, let's put it that way, the object of the future is not available to us. So therefore, it's a door open. It's a door wide open for prognosis. Many people predicted the deathbed and claims that are not sustained. It's data that Africa would be, completely destroyed by COVID. It's not that the case, touch wood. You can see other people approaching the future by scenarios, constructing a perspective approach based on combination of selected indicators to assess the likely direct impact of the damage related to COVID. And this is the new era of backcasting, where you see the future and you try to adjust your institution and your momentum right now to respond to an outcome which is desirable. And last but not least, we have a lot of statistical projections, this forecasting or period probabilistic approaches. But we have to consider this future as not being one feature in Africa. It can be several. It can be several for several thematic bounds, which we ambition to create for a better, transformation for Africa. So a future for Africa, which is really, responding to African challenge, should start with a deferral of our expression of what we see the future we want. In the very first time, Africa would loudly say, this is the future we want, and that future is not likely to be the future that the other countries, also the continent, will want. We have our own future, which is not likely to be a future of unsustainable economic development or profit-oriented economy, but rather a future of sustainable development, which is something I will mention at the end of my talk. And in the third talking point about those two layers, after those two layers of the rhetoric and the future one, Future Africa and the University of Pretoria. And when I'm talking about Future Africa and the University of Pretoria, I'm talking about all universities of Africa, all institutions generating knowledge, all institutions that are established as a learning system to be part of the solution. And these are the reasons why I'm saying that. First of all, we will not rely on the pick and roll approach. There was so many solutions driven by the North and then applied in Africa, and the context was not appropriate for them to prosper. Then we collapsed in many respects. And we are now in a situation which is more like a roller coaster model, where the trajectory are not clear, but at the same time, this gives us a wake-up call that we need to create a discussion among faculties. The reality is more complex than what we perceive at first glance. There's so many dimensions that in COVID that we cannot afford creating a sustainable solution for COVID by working on our silos, by working on our departments, by working on our faculties. As Prof. Kupe mentioned, from the disciplinary studies we had on remote sensing, we tend to try to create a state where those solutions which are technically driven, the innovations, to be relevant for society, and that's where transformation can happen. So the second aspect, which is important for the scholars to think about, is we need to change our business model to accommodate the current and future shift. Prof. Kupe pledged it several times and really defended the issue of hybrid education system, where digital reform and innovation was coming as a higher level to supplement the factual presence of students in campus. And this is the kind of rapid transformation that was triggered by COVID. But sadly, in this model, finance is central. But what we have seen, which is more sadly, is that finance is just, partial in the way it covers the COVID crisis. It's more the funding availed for interventionist or humanitarian survival measures. We need to project ourselves on the long-term economic aspect and the way we do business in the future that will not affect the survival of the country. At the same time, we create an opportunity for development. I would like to add to those 2 points that we can be Africa, and I'm very serious when I'm saying that. Africa can be the source of the solution for COVID-19 in terms of medical intervention and other dimensions. Because the richness of the, small solutions that aggregate at local level, can be really the seedbed for wider transformation of society. We have so many biodiversity in place, which can, solve so many problems. And until now, that biodiversity with neglected plants, which can serve as a good nutrition basis, which can be, a drag for people to solve some issues. So it's untapped resources. And we have to be serious on investing research activities and funding in this untapped natural resources. I'll finish my quick statement by telling you what Future Africa is currently doing. We have been invited by the Vice-Chancellor and the Deputy Vice-Chancellor to establish a platform which is creating the connections between all research that is done to Kupe within University of Pretoria and beyond. And this platform is needed. The transdisciplinarity cannot be something we put into practice if at the scale of the university already, we do not establish the connections between disciplines and departments to cross-fertilize. What my colleague Wanda is doing is very relevant to other colleagues working on forestry, on food security, on soil fertility, on social dynamics, on human rights, on arts. So we have to create a coalition of willing. We have to create a community of practice, which bringing all those scholars together to design sustainable solutions for Africa. And that's the purpose of this platform we are trying to touch. At the same time, this platform will help establish a benchmarking of solutions. There are so many good practice out there, so many mid-range strategies that have been established. Remember, even though we are confined by COVID, there's so many things which were going on the background. And those people continuing their business has established, due process to make sure that the COVID is not spreading. We have to learn from our countries. We have to learn from all the countries. What has happened to some countries in Asia is really amazing. Though they have high density of population, the spread of the COVID was very low. And at a very short time, they managed to flip the spread and get into a safer place. So we have to do a compendium of what is worthwhile considering when this kind of crisis happens in Africa for a second time. We hope not so. And using the digital platform will really help disseminate those knowledge and those wisdom. And that's what Future Africa will do. We are actively working with the communication and different faculties. We are trying to get resources to get an umbrella program, which are trying to invite all those energies in the same place and create sustainable solutions that respond to African challenges. And this will help legitimize the inevitable transformation to serve as a catalyst for a rapid adaptation to a wider society, and just to start from the university. Since the inception of this crisis, universities have been at the spotlight. Researchers have been at the spotlight. But for the first time, the policymakers, celerity in picking up the message from the scientists has been unprecedented. Science has been released for the last 50 years about sustainability and the use of biodiversity. It was never seriously taken. Right now with COVID, the eyes and the brains of our leaders are wide open to pick up and start all the solutions that are coming from the universities. And it's our time now to create sustainable solutions for our policymakers and our society. I'll end up saying that all these things respond to our ambition to develop sustainably. Sustainable development would be the last option and the first resort for Africa, I believe. In the view of the economic dimension we're getting, our countries would require consideration on sustainable development. We cannot just afford to embrace this profit-based economy, which will at the end have a backlash on our society. In terms of COVID, it can be social instability, it can be anything. But we have to reinvent the way we do our economy and we develop our economy by considering the full value of nature, by considering the natural capital as important as the built capital, which is the built environment we have. So, and we have to adapt the technology, we have to adapt our education and our research to respond to deliver on this sustainable solution. Joel, this is at the nutshell what I would like to share with the communities to initiate the discussion we would like to have in this COVID and post-COVID era. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Mbao, and for really setting out a really visionary set of ideas for future Africa, for the University of Pretoria, but also getting all of us as scholars to think about what you're calling long-term transformative research strategies. This is something we're all going to have to think about. We're all going to have to leave the silos of our disciplines in order to think about the complexities that the world faces. I just want to say to everyone listening, we have about 15 minutes remaining. I strongly encourage you to go on the Future Africa website and just see some of the exciting research that's happening there. It's a regularly updated website, www.futureafrica.science, just to see some of the work that Professor Mbao was talking about. So I want to get into some questions, and I'm seeing a lot of interest here. So I'm going to start with you, Professor Kupe. I had promised that I have a question that I want to ask you, but I'm not going to ask it. I'm going to throw a curveball. It's linked to a question that's posed by one of the listeners, which is, what are the plans that UP has to rebuild the time that we've lost on teaching and research? And as you answer that question, Professor Kupe, if you can just take us through some of the challenges of leadership in a time of uncertainty, because even questions about how do we move on are still uncertain, they're full of risk, they're full of anxiety. But the question really is, how are we going to get the teaching and research time back, or how are we going to get it back on track?
Yeah, so I think that we're going to get it back, but by that I don't mean every second and every minute. Time lost can never be regained. However, it is also true to say that the University of Pretoria has reimagined its academic calendar. So we are not going to actually, in a sense, proceed as if nothing happened. So our academic calendar is going to take us all the way up to mid-December, if not just before Christmas, in order, as the concept being used these days, is to save the academic year 2020. If there is a disruption of that, because remember, we're working in uncertain times as well, there are also projections that actually the spike in infections we see now could lead to another one or two perhaps shorter lockdowns. We will also might have to actually move into 2021. But I think there's one thing that is interesting at the University of Pretoria is that no institution has been left unscathed by this in the way in which it operates. Our fundamental model at the University of Pretoria was hybrid teaching and learning, if you talk about teaching and learning. But it was anchored on contact teaching, if you like. We now have had to move to the other extreme, which is just purely online teaching and learning, which is not what was our plan. That comes with all of its glitches. We've been able so far to provide students with laptops, devices. We're providing students, we can't provide that because of their social circumstances, no electricity, no connectivity, hard teaching materials. We are also right now in the business, mobilize some funds and mobilizing more to hire a lot of tutors and people who are teaching assistants. So Profs, you might get some assistance coming your way from these parts in order to assist you to assist those students who, because of online glitches and unfavorable learning conditions at home and all of those glitches, might need to be beefed up. We'll also use summer schools and winter schools, if you like, to actually, in a sense, and shorten the holidays a bit in order to capture the time. So we have a multiple strategy, actually, in a sense, to try and recover as much of this time as we can. So, and that reflects also the challenges I face on a day-to-day basis. So how do you keep the ship? And the building I sit in is shaped like a ship. It's actually called the ship. How do you keep the ship sailing? Is you have to think all the time ahead. So you will find that the University of Pretoria, we sort of could see where things were going. So some of our teaching and learning plans online that have landed well is because 2 weeks or so before that, we started putting things in motion, if you like. And also some of the investments we made in IT technology has enabled us to have, for example, the zero rating access to teaching and learning resources. We've now beefed them up with data to students, 10 megabytes during the daytime, 10 megabytes for use, especially in doing tests and assignments. So those are things. My next meeting today is to meet with some of the CEOs of telecommunications companies together with the other vice-chancellors to negotiate better costed data deals. Because we've had to divert some funds also in that direction. I'm also pleased to announce that a lot of our supporters, foundations, philanthropists, have donated quite a lot of money our way for both research as well as for buying laptops for students and devices. So my perpetual headache is, how do you keep the ship sailing in the right direction in so very choppy and unusual waters, and how do you make sure you land on shore without too much damage?
That is a massive challenge indeed. One of the very interesting things, colleagues, that I'm seeing on the questions, the recurring theme of the questions that we're seeing is, how do we think about the social and human dimension together with the scientific technological dimension? And this is, of course, also an interest of mine, as you pointed out. There's the science that we need to get right, but there's also the human rights questions. There's also the philosophical questions. There's also the arts. Because the questions are somewhat intricate, and we only have about 10 or so minutes remaining, I'm going to ask you, Professor Simbao and Markota. I'm going to start with you, Professor Markota. In your own work, as a scientist primarily, how do you see that connection between the work you're doing around infectious diseases and learning about this condition, and how other disciplines, and particularly the social and human element, comes together in your research?
Thank you, Prof. I think I really reflected lately on the way that we do things as virologists, because we focus too much on the pathogens. And I think just from the personal way I see it is really designing research programs from the society perspective and not the other way around. You know, really thinking what societies are we dealing with, what's the risks, and work from that perspective. And relationships. I mean, we forget about relationships in research. We need to build really sustainable long-term relationships, not just with professional people, but with the communities that we work with. And then we will be able to have a better understanding through our research of what's really going on the ground and how it can change people's lives. And that's just a personal reflection.
So if I might add there, if you don't mind, Prof. Modiri, is that I think Prof. Wanda is correct, is that just generally as universities, sometimes we've tended to become somewhat insular. We talk about the excellence of our research and also who's the best researcher and the best institution, but we don't talk too much about how does our research make a difference in real lives, research that matters, if you like. So I agree with Prof. Makota that what is important is challenge-led research. You ask yourself the questions, what are the issues that are there out in society? And you do that talking to stakeholders or actors in society. And then also, what could research bring as a solution? And you're actually thinking of very specific, complicated, and related matters. And I think I fully agree with you that virologists must think about actually what are the, not the epidemiological trajectories of a virus, but what are its social trajectories, and also its impact on society, and how could you actually get a better society out of addressing both the medical side of it and the social, health, economic, and livelihood aspects of it. I think you have seen it with many governments where in lockdowns now that they have now found that people are saying, yes, we understand the logic of the lockdown, but however, we're now suffering in other ways. How you balance these two things? Yes, I want to stay alive, but I don't want to survive the disease and die of hunger and lack of a livelihood.
Yeah, I mean, this for me already opens up a lot of questions about what is a livable existence, what's a sustainable existence, and what is the old philosophical question about the good life. Professor Mbao, if you are around, do you have some contributions on this? You've anchored much of your contribution already about the ways in which transdisciplinary research, the science and the social meeting. But what was interesting in your contribution was the comment you made at the end about the ways in which research can influence policy. Of course, research not made or directed towards policy, but research that can nonetheless impact policy, especially government policy, governments and international organizations are relying a lot on researchers for some of the ideas, the frameworks on responding to the pandemic. Can you say a bit more around the place of research in shaping policy around this pandemic, but in shaping policy for sustainable life more generally?
Thank you so much for that question. First of all, let me just be a bit provocative. What is the policy, demanded research? What does it really mean? To me, I really struggle to see, what with the unique questions the policymakers will ask that has a unique response from the science. It's very difficult because, if you just consider science and policy as one channel of communicating knowledge to create transformation, we're missing something here, which is the people in between. Where is the place of society? Because the society itself mandated those policymakers to take a decision on their behalf. So should we listen more to the policymakers rather than the social communities, or should we combine those two requests and try to see how to fit the request in one block and create the pace for response? And at the same time, the scientists you are targeting are part of the society. They also have their own concerns, their own projections. So I don't usually take example from the North, but for this time, I will give you an example from Steve Jobs. When Steve Jobs created an iPhone, he says nobody asked him to create an iPhone, but he realized that when people want to use their iPhone as a computer, as an email, as a telephone, as a fax machine and everything, so he needed to create a device that combined all those things in one block. So it's more about anticipating for the Africa and the of Africa would have in this kind of reality which comes in compare the enemy we're trying to prepare people for enemy that create the future for people and intuitively they're very similar, but in practice it's really different. So what I'm hearing here is that the science should listen to a wide range of societal decision makers, the private sector, the community association, the village association, the people in the rural areas, the people in the urban areas, and embracing the diversity of aspiration, because we have different values and norms when you come from one group of society to the other group of society. And if you're not very careful to listen to all that diversity, we will just respond to one channel of challenges, which is not embracing the total approach, the encompassing approach, the system thinking requested for doing the transformation of Africa. And before I give back to you the floor, let me just say about the human rights thing you mentioned when my colleague Wanda mentioned. I don't think there is any aspect you're talking about now, about health, about food security, about education, about X, Y, and Z, which are not human rights at itself. So society has the right to get a good food and nutrition to build a great immune system. They have the right to get good education, whether a physical process of educating them or a virtual process of educating them. People need to have access to knowledge, without which we cannot create the transformation. And you can extend the list widely. What is more important to me is what are the domestic solutions? Because Africa cannot just import solutions for its own problems. We need to create our own solutions to our own problems. Though we are not close to what we just have, we are open to cross-fertilization with others, and that's where maybe the big challenges are. Back to you, Joel, and thank you for the question.
Thank you, Professor Mbowe. As I've said, we're almost out of time. I'm going to ask Professor Makota and Professor Kupe just for final 30-second responses before we close. This is a big topic. We will not answer all the questions, and this is an ongoing conversation that we've just opened up in new directions. But just short 30-second reflections, both on what Professor Mbowe said and some last thoughts as well before we close. Professor Makota.
So I think just reiterating that we as Africans understand and have compassion for our environment. We should be the leaders to build long-term partnerships globally, professionally, with professional people, but also relationships with societies and really understand the challenges and the solutions that will work in our environment and in our communities. And I think UP is embracing these new opportunities in refocusing our research to be transdisciplinary, and we're creating platforms. We already have platforms to do this. There's a lot in place to really just go forward. And this will have a real impact on our communities, our country, the continent, and ultimately shaping a world post-COVID for Africa.
Thank you, Professor Makota. Professor Kupe.
I think the way UP and other African universities, especially in this alliance called the African Research Universities Association, have come to the party across the board with research that is directed at addressing the COVID-19 shows the potential that exists in African knowledge institutions and requires that the governments and other global partners invest much more in their research capacities, because we're actually doing this from a very low and limited resource base. Imagine if you had much more resources, would actually make a greater contribution for the continent itself, but as my colleagues have said, a contribution that also has resonance and relevance to the rest of the globe. So I think that in thinking of a post-COVID, if that's the term we should use, Africa, we should think about reinvesting and large investments in all of the infrastructure that you need to have. Knowledge institutions that are responsive, reactive, can make a decisive difference for the Africa we want.
Thank you very much. Already, as you can see from the questions and the discussion there's many more things to talk about. How do we map out sustainable scientific and medical research? How do we expand the global conversation around science? What is the impact on the economy and human rights, on the state, on governance? How do we do knowledge in a complex transdisciplinary environment and rethink the university and the education sector? So we've traversed many topics, and I see we've now reached the end of this particular discussion, but as with all discussion, the discussion never ends here. For both our audience and our colleagues who are in fact doing the work, Professor Kupe has already mentioned the meeting that he's going to be a part of. Professor Mbo and Professor Makota are right at work and are continuing to drive research during this time of lockdown. So for those who are listening, these are some of the questions we'd like you to take home that have been brought up here around what is research and knowledge and the continent going to look like now and in the future. It's a post-COVID future, but it's also an unpredictable future with its own challenges. I want to close then by thanking Professor Kupe for the idea of having this webinar and for hosting us on this webinar, and we look forward to more such discussions. To the now 134 people listening from around the world, we also want to thank you very much. I'm assuming that many of you are scholars who, like me, yearn and continue to yearn for the kind of intellectual debate conversation that we are in a way missing out on. We've all had to cancel conferences and visits, and most importantly, we've had to close our classrooms, which is where most of us do our most important work. So we hope as scholars that you take some of these questions into the future as you think about a future Africa, but of course also a future world and a future society. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to our colleagues, Professor Kupe, Professor Mbao, Professor Makota, and to everyone listening. And a special thank you to our colleagues in audio-visual who've been providing the support. There's always someone behind the screen who's making all of this possible. So thank you to everyone, and thank you for attending. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.